So yesterday we had started off with the introduction of Portrait of a Lady. As I had told you, this chapter, it is a tribute by Khushwant Singh for his grandmother. Now, what is a tribute? It is to acknowledge, to say thank you, to show the importance of someone in your life. And here Khushwant Singh, he has written this beautiful chapter talking about the role that his grandmother had to play in his life, and how, so many changes happened in her life. But she was such a calm, composed, religious person. And never ever had he seen her, like raising her voice or getting upset about situations. And where did she get that strength from? She got that strength from her prayers. So most of the time, what did he see her doing? He saw her like, moving the beads of the rosary and spending time in prayer. So always her lips were silently reciting the prayers. And that is where she got the strength from. And yes, so there have been different phases in his life with grandmother. One when he was small and they were in the village together. Then when it came to the city, when he had to go to college and university. And how did grandmother cope with all the changes, right? And yes, so grandmother was an old lady. And for us to really accept that our grandparents could have been young ones, or even our parents, like we love them the way they are right now. And imagining them to be different, right? It is a stretch of our imagination. So here Khushwant Singh also says that he never ever thought that his grandmother could have been young and pretty and beautiful. So she had always been old and she could only grow older, right? So here he is giving a glowing tribute to his grandmother, acknowledging the role that she had to play, and yes, how she was a very important part of his life. So we are indebted to our grandparents, the values they teach us, the traditions they pass on to us, or the stories they tell us, the things they make for us, or the pampering and love and affection. So no one can replace that love, right? So let's start with this chapter. Let's continue what we were reading yesterday. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Grandmother. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. And yes, so she had always been like that. She had been short and fat and slightly bent. Because the passing of time, and yes, the posture has changed. It was difficult for her to walk, and she had wrinkles all over her face. So from one end to the other, it was a crisscross of wrinkles. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and stayed at the same age for 20 years. So she could not have grown older, like because she had so many wrinkles. She had perfectly white, silver, gray hair, right? As you might call it. And yes, she was so old that he felt that she's been at the same age for so long. Wait, was joined here. So he cannot imagine her to be even more older. So it seems that she's stuck at this age. She cannot have grown older, right? She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Yes. Grandmother there looking so beautiful. Can you tell me here, what does this line mean? She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Yeah, yes. Of course, here, beauty definitely lies in the eyes of the beholder. Well said, Navya. And not pretty, like, of course, it was not that she had perfect features and that is what made her so beautiful. What made her beautiful was her overall appearance. right? So in spite of the wrinkles, in spite of the way she walked, and yes, she was old as long as he had been around her, there was a beauty around her, right? So it is not necessarily someone has to be picture perfect. You have to have a very glowing skin and perfect features, and only then you are beautiful. No. What is beauty? Right, as you said, it lies in the eyes of the beholder, and beauty is something that comes from within, that glow that you get, that radiance you give to others, right? So yes, so that is why he said she was not pretty, like she did not have these extraordinary features, but she was so beautiful. The way she carried herself, the way she was there moving around in the house, the way she was wearing all this white clothes that she wore, and the silver locks and the wrinkles on her face. And generally we think that as like we grow older, we're going to lose our beauty. But as we grow old, there is grace, there is beauty. And we love our grandmother the way she is. We will always love our parents, no matter how old they become, right? Because even in that age, even in the old years, right, we find beauty. Clear? Yes. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is what makes everybody beautiful. It is not your features, it is not your appearance, it is not the way you dress up and all, but it is so many things combined. It is a kind of that energy you give, the vibes you give, and yeah, like, of course, how do you make the people around you feel? So that is what is beautiful. She hobbled the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. So how did she walk around? One hand on her waist and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Mala japti rehti thi, right? She had that rosary and she would keep on telling the beads. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Aren't they beautiful lines? No one could have described, like, yes, so beautifully he has described wrinkles on her face. And yes, her face is puckered up, because of the, when people grow old, the loss of denture, loss of teeth also are puckered up over there, right? But in spite of that, the way she's not very concerned about her appearance also. Her hair is not very neat and tidy. The scattered, yes, so for those of you who don't know, this is one of your English book. One is Hornbill, the other is Snapshots. Okay, so for those of you who joined us today, it's a reminder. So this is your book. So Hornbill is one book and the other is Snapshots. Okay, I'll text you also if you don't remember. So she has been compared to this expanse of the landscape. Yes, so the mountains there covered with snow, how beautiful they are, how breathtaking they are. So that is what grandmother looked like. So beautiful and so peaceful. So looking at her gave so much of contentment. Yes, so she has been compared with the winter landscape. Yeah. So she was beautiful, not necessarily pretty. And now we understand the difference. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. So at a young age, the grandson and his grandmother, they were alone. Khushwant Singh's parents, they had to go to the city in search of a job. And in the meanwhile, what did they do? They left him in the village with his grandmother. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. Isn't this a very common scenario in every home? Right, so you wake up in the morning, you'll have, right, so whether it is their mother or father, or if it is grandparents, so they'll be saying their prayers, they'll be reciting prayers so that you can listen to them and learn something. But here, what did the grandson do? What did Khushwant Singh do? He would listen to her prayers, but he never had any intention of learning. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song, एक ही जैसी आवाज में, एक ही सुर में, while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. Yes, so what was it? What was the routine of the grandson and grandmother in the village? How would she help him to get ready to school? And what did she do while getting him ready? She would constantly recite prayers with the hope that one day he would learn them. Did the grandson have any intention of learning them? No, he did not. So he just loved to hear the voice of grandmother. What other things were there? Can you tell me the things that he would carry to school? Have you heard of them? My wooden slate, a tiny ink pot, yellow chalk, all tied in a bundle. Yes, have you ever heard your grandparents telling about how they used to write their lessons on this wooden slate? So this wooden slate was there, and like after washing it, and it would be plastered with this yellow colored chalk, and it would be allowed to dry. Then with the ink pot, so they would mix this ink and with the pen there, and then they would write the work which was given to them. And yes, so they would carry that slate and show it to the teacher, right? So yes, have you heard your grandparents talking about this, or have you heard of all this? So this was, yeah. And nowadays, when you have to go to school and it's a new session, and what are the things you need? You need a new bag and you need a new stationery, so many things, right? Yes, it's a long list before the new session, but he's going to school in a very simple manner. What about breakfast? What was breakfast? Breakfast was a stale chapati with white butter and sugar, right? So these are little things, and beautiful moments that he's cherished from his childhood. And these moments, no matter how old you grow, no matter how far you go away from your home, but yes, these childhood moments will always be in our heart. And so he wanted to write about them. He wanted to thank grandmother for giving such beautiful memories. Yes, so they went to school together. So in the village, what did grandmother do in the village? When they were together, she would get him ready for school. Yes. And she would carry breakfast, or rather she would make breakfast of a stale chapati with butter and sugar. And they would carry some stale chapatis also along with them, right? So very simple routine they had, a very simple life they led over there in the village. Yeah, let's continue. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. Earlier days, many of the schools were there attached with the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. So the priest, he would take the classes. They taught us the alphabet and he also taught the morning prayer, right? And that is why a lot of religious teaching also done. While the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, my grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So while he took his classes, while he learned his lessons, what did grandmother do? She would sit there and read the scriptures, right? So she would read the religious text. And then when he had finished with his classes and grandmother would have finished with her reading of the religious text, so they would walk back together. And the village dogs, they would also meet them and they would follow them, right? And what would they wait for? Why would they follow them? Because every day grandmother would carry chapatis for the dog, right? Yes, so this was their routine. So she would get him dressed for school, and he would go attend his classes. She would sit there inside the temple and say her prayers and just read the scriptures. Then they would walk back home. And on the way, they would feed the dogs also, right? And that is why grandmother carried the stale chapati. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. Sent for us, they called us. So they were settled there, maybe they found a job and a home. So now they've called a grandmother and their son. That was a turning point in our friendship. Turning point. A change happened in their lives, right? How did it change? Now earlier they were in the village, now they have come to the city. How is grandmother going to cope with the city life? And what about the relationship between the grandson and the grandmother? Is it going to change? Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school. Why she didn't go to school with him? I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. So he used to go by bus. And that means the school was quite far away and grandmother could not accompany him. There were no dogs in the streets and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. So it must have been quite a peaceful area in those times when there were not many dogs out there in the streets. So we can have a look now how things have changed. There's so many dogs out on the streets, isn't it? Yes. And so because there were not many dogs over there in the streets in the area that they lived, so what did grandmother start doing? What did she start doing? She started feeding sparrows, right? Clear? Is this clear till here? Any doubts? Any doubts? No? Right.